Sometimes it can happen that a person who comes from a religious home is exposed to a great deal of anti-sex propaganda when he is young. Sometimes it can happen that such a person has difficulty in liberating himself from the effects of such teaching in later years. Do you have any advice to give on this subject?
Well, there are several points perhaps worth making here. To begin with, this question really has to be seen as part of the person involved's struggle for intellectual independence. It has to be seen as part of the process of his healthy maturation, whereby he develops himself to the point where he is able to question any and all of the precepts or teachings or ideas to which he's been exposed, and to take a fresh look, a first-handed look at the world around him and at the issues affecting his own life. So that part of it would be an issue of the person simply in general learning to function in a more independent way. However, I'd like to add something to that to the following effect. One of the commonest and at the same time worst mistakes which many young people and not so young people make is that in their attempts to free themselves from religious teachings on sex, they can swing to what they believe is an opposite pole, and the sad, tragic joke is on them because it's not an opposite pole at all. And I refer now to the people who swing in the direction of sexual promiscuity. Let me explain what I mean here. You see, the essence of the religious view is that sex is evil, is low, is depraved, belongs to the lower bodily functions, that it has nothing to do with man's mind, values, or spirit. Now, it's not much of a revolt against that view to say that sex pertains to our bodily functions, it's got nothing to do with my mind, values, or spirit, only it's not depraved. In other words, to accept the religious view that sex is essentially a mindless activity, having nothing to do with one's spirit and values, but that's okay, so we plunge into the mire and we don't pretend we're anything but pigs, is not much of a revolt, because what the person who pursues a course of kind of mindless, unselective sexual promiscuity has in common with the religionist view of sex is that both believe that a man's sex life has no relationship to his values, no relationship to his convictions, no relationship to his mind. And in fact, that kind of view of sex, which divorces it from mind, values, and spirit, whether the practitioner involved knows it or not, does reflect a profound contempt for sex because of the following. Here is an activity which people care desperately about, which entails great emotional involvement. It's not a marginal activity in most people's lives. It's a very important activity, as it should be. But they accept the view that it's an activity utterly devoid of spiritual or intellectual meaning. Well, if you reflect on it, there's something very humiliating about the notion of being that involved, that deeply and passionately caught up in an activity which is devoid of spiritual or intellectual meaning. That's very humiliating. Therefore, my own view, in contradistinction to the religious view on the one hand and to the cult of mindless promiscuity on the other hand, would be one that would argue for a very positive and affirmative view of sex, but which would advocate extreme sexual selectivity, which would argue that sex is good, it's one of the greatest values of being alive is in the possibility of sexual experience, but it's not something that one deals with casually, mindlessly, or promiscuously.
We are all aware that a personal dispute has led to a break between Miss Rand and you. Does that break reflect or indicate any change in your philosophical convictions regarding objectivism?
Most emphatically not. The break between Miss Rand and me was over a personal matter. It was not an issue of a philosophical conflict or of an ideological difference of opinion. So that while today I'm afraid Miss Rand would not call me an objectivist, nonetheless I do call myself an objectivist. And by an objectivist, I mean, in this context, someone who, A, thoroughly understands the philosophy of objectivism, and B, is in intellectual agreement with it. At no point has my understanding of objectivism been challenged by anyone, Miss Rand included, to the best of my knowledge. And while I do not intend to devote as much time to the teaching of objectivism as in the past, now that I have closed NBI, it is my intention, as I've already made clear, to concentrate much more in my own field, which is psychology. And I might mention that one of the good things which came out of the break, even if it came about in a tragic way, was that I am spending my time doing what matters to me most now, to a fuller extent than ever before, which is to say, writing research in the field of psychology. I can't say what degree of teaching of objectivism I'll do in the future, certainly nothing in degree comparable to the amount of time I gave it in the past. I still am in full agreement with objectivism. I'm very much concerned to fight for the spread of the philosophy of objectivism. And to repeat, this conflict between us was over a personal matter. It should never have been made public, and I should never have been forced by Miss Rand, as I was, to reply publicly to her charges as I did. It does not indicate any change in my philosophical convictions. Yes?
How do you think the break between Miss Rand and yourself might affect the future growth of objectivism in this culture?
That's a hard question to answer. In long-range terms, I don't think it will affect it adversely at all. Some students have been concerned over the mileage which will be gotten out of this conflict by the opponents of objectivism, who can now chortle over this dispute. I don't think they matter at all, and I don't think it really makes an awful lot of difference. I do think that the closing of NBI was very unfortunate, although selfishly I have to say I'm glad of it, because it did liberate me to pursue my own career on a full-time basis. I think that perhaps it might even lead to good consequences, the break might, if it gets students to separate the ideas from personalities, and if it gives them the feeling of being more on their own, so much the better. In long-range terms, I don't think you can stop ideas. I think that objectivism represents a great intellectual achievement. More and more people are coming to realize this with every week and month and year that passes. And I don't think, to repeat in long-range terms, that this dispute is going to have any adverse effect. Unfortunately, in short-range terms, some of the policies which Miss Rand and her friends are advocating, the pressure which they are putting on students to accept her version of this conflict in its entirety, her demands that any allegedly right-thinking objectivist, quote-unquote, repudiate and denounce Nathaniel Branden, is causing a significant loss of respect toward her on the part of many students who don't care to have this kind of demand or ultimatum put to them. But there will be a certain amount of disillusionment and fights, perhaps, among students of objectivism who have conflicting views on this subject. And right now, historically, it might look like that's pretty important to all of you, but it really isn't. That will pass. It's very unimportant. I've talked to many of you this evening before the session began and at a previous meeting, and most of you have told me you don't really give a damn about the conflict between Miss Rand and me. You're interested in the ideas, and that is the rational attitude. Your business is the ideas and the truth of the ideas and what you will make of them in your own lives. That, I think, is the only intelligently selfish perspective to have on this conflict. It's a personal problem, it's a personal tragedy, if you wish. I don't believe it has anything of importance to do